Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Be honest. When's the last time you had a homemade meal? We get it. Between meetings, workout classes, and the kids' after-school sports, who's got time to cook? That's where HelloFresh comes in. No matter how busy you get, HelloFresh has everything you need to get an easy, home-cooked meal on the table. With flavor-packed recipes like Parmesan herb-crusted salmon, you'll be filling your kitchen with the cozy aromas of a homemade meal in no time. So go ahead, try HelloFresh. It's homemade, made easy. Learn more at HelloFresh.com.
It's the Larry Kudlow Show. Free market prosperity starts here. Now, here's Larry Kudlow.
So, welcome back. Let's talk a little bit on the economy with our great friend John Carney, Breitbart news editor, economics and finance, and he's the co-author of the Breitbart Business Digest. It's out daily. It's a must-read, by the by. John, welcome back.
Thanks.
You and I were the only ones, best I could tell. I'm just going to say this. When Trump made his statement at Davos to the Davos, I call them the Davos ghosts, the ones that didn't get the memo to Mar-a-Lago. But anyway, he said that interest rates will come down conditioned on a drop in oil prices. He wasn't slamming the Fed. He was making a different point, and it was an important point. By the way, part of it was aimed at Saudi Arabia. He wants them to produce more. That would bring down oil prices, especially Brent crude, which would damage Russia, which is dependent on oil. It's the only cash crop they have. And, of course, his own drill, baby, drill, but that's going to take a while to get started. But I don't see him. He wasn't. I mean, I read your piece on it. I said the same thing that night, and Trump repeated it the next day with even greater clarity. Some of you might have sent him what either of us wrote. He's basically saying get oil down. And one last thing, our friend Joe Livornia actually did a little write-up of it. If oil prices fell back, let's say to mid-50s, for argument's sake, Joe estimated that could knock 50 basis points off the inflation rate directly, but the indirect effects would knock off another 80, because, oil permeates the entire economy, hundreds of items. And so you could get it down to, he's saying, from 2.7% presently on the CPI down to 1.4%. But that's what Trump was saying. He wasn't. I don't think he was screaming at the Fed. He said, "We'll talk about the Fed later."
That's right, Larry. The most of the reporting on this was so bad. It was just one of these cases of people allowing the narrative that they've set up for themselves, that they feed to their readers and listeners and viewers, that there's this clash between the Trump and the Fed, and the Trump's going to somehow undermine Fed independence. And so they looked at what he said through that lens. But in fact, the Fed has said that they're planning on cutting interest rates. Trump said he only wants them to cut interest rates. He's only going to demand it if the price of oil comes down, which, as you said, and as Joe Livornia showed in that very good note, that will knock off just very directly, mechanically, because gasoline and oil are part of the consumer price index. That will bring down the consumer price index. And then because everything in the country runs on energy, once you bring down the prices of gasoline and oil and natural gas, you will then have a knock-on effect that will start to bring down inflation. And it will get us to a point where I think the Fed will be very comfortable cutting. And I agree with you also that this was a message that went beyond just about U.S. policy. And he made it very clear. He said he thinks the rest of the world will also be able to bring down their interest rates. So he's telling basically the rest of the world, look, I am going to help you. I'm going to bring down your energy costs. That will allow your central banks to lower energy rates. And this is directed, as you said, partly to Saudi Arabia, but also to Putin. Yep. He's telling him, look, you are going to lose your fossil fuel revenue because we are going to bring the price down. And this is part of his plan to make peace in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are going to be shocked when this happens.
Well, I think that's the basic logic of it. And as you say, it was lost on so many reporters and analysts, just completely lost, because they were projecting a big fistfight with the Fed. I still read that crap in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. He doesn't have any interest in picking a fight with the Fed. He doesn't have any interest, by the way, in letting Biden inflation, rise during his first year or two. He doesn't want that at all. But he has what I call an oil-centric view of inflation. He's not a monetarist, okay? He's an oil-centric view. And actually, it's a very powerful view. I don't think it's the whole story about inflation, but it's a key part of the story.
Some things you wouldn't mind being stuck with, like a huge inheritance. But a phone that has to be plugged in just right so it charges is not one of those things. Switch to Verizon and we'll pay off your old phone up to $800 via prepaid MasterCard for a new one on us. Just trade in any phone from our top brands with select unlimited plans. $829.99 purchase with new smartphone line on select unlimited plans. Minimum $90 per month with auto pay plus taxes and fees for 36 months required. Less $830 trade-in/promo credit applied over 36 months. Trade-in terms apply. Payoff phone requires smartphone purchase and port-in with new smartphone line on select plan. Must provide most recent bill showing payoff amount of eligible phone. Additional terms apply.
About inflation.
There's a lot of work that actually shows that a huge part of the inflation spike that happened back in the 1970s was very directly related to the oil crisis of that period. So obviously that was a formative period in Donald Trump's mind. So I'm not surprised that he looks at the world that way. And I do think that there is something to it. I think you need monetary accommodation to get oil to become inflationary. So I combine both of them, but I do think he is correct in that if you are able to bring the price of oil down and you're not having too accommodative of a monetary policy, then you should be able to bring inflation down. The danger is if the Fed kept cutting and made monetary policy too accommodative, then even if the price of oil came down, you'd still end up with a lot of inflation. And I think Donald Trump, as you correctly said, does not want that to happen in his first few years in office. He wants to get out of the weight of Biden inflation and not see it continue.
Yeah, I think that's right, 100%. John, you also wrote a note on the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two government-sponsored housing agencies. And I agree, by the way. We did this in the first term, but Mr. Trump never had any particular enthusiasm for getting involved other than maybe boosting the balance sheets, putting more capital into them. But in terms of rearranging their capital structures and, privatizing them like commercial banks, I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't hear it. I could be wrong, but I agree with you.
I think a lot of people got way overexcited when we had this change of administration. They said you started to get some of these hedge fund managers coming out and basically say they think that there is going to be a very rapid move that would privatize the Fannie and Freddie, and that would enrich the holders of their common shares and their junior preferred shares. And I don't see that happening. Look, I talked to Scott Bassett. I've talked to a lot of people in the administration. This is not on their priority list. There were people who were speculating that Trump would do this on day one or within the first 100 days. I don't think anything like that is going to happen. Who knows a few years from now? I do think, a lot of very smart people agree that if we could find a way to lessen the government's influence and, frankly, the influence of these two big companies on the mortgage market to make a more competitive mortgage market, that would be great. But it's not something that's going to be rushed through. They're not going to – look, we have tariffs. We have tax cuts. We have deregulation. We have ESG and DEI to get out of all these government programs. There's a lot to do. Cutting Fannie and Freddie loose from their conservatorships is not going to be on that list anytime soon.
John, you have a bank account at the Bank of America or Chase?
Yeah, look, I've spoken to both Bank of America and Chase about this. And frankly, Larry, I think, remember when Mark Zuckerberg told us that he was throwing people off Facebook because the Biden administration was telling him to?
Yeah.
As I dig into this, what I am discovering is the banks are saying something very similar happened. Pressure came on to them to start debanking more people.
Right.
And they followed through. And look, the government fined TD, it's Toronto Dominion, it's a Canadian bank, but they fined TD Bank $3 billion on anti-money, for not having a good enough anti-money laundering field. So that sent a message to all the other banks. Hey, you better start getting rid of people. And believe me, if you got a memo from the Fed or the OCC, and you know where the Biden administration is on trying to crush conservatives, what would you do? You would start to say, okay, the first people we're going to debank are going to be those conservatives. So I do think we're going to discover something very similar happened, which was you had pressure from the Biden administration to debank conservatives, and the banks went along with it because, frankly, when you're a bank, you are very much you know this. You worked at the Fed, Larry. Banks have to do what the government tells them.
Oh, yes, that's right. Ultimately, they do. It's very hard for them not to. So I agree with all that. I find it amusing, but it's not amusing because it's a very big story, and there'll be a legacy if I hope they crawl out of it.
I don't want to tell you where I banked because I'm worried that they'll come after them if if they find out where Carney and Kudlow keep their money.
John Carney is Breitbart news editor for economics and finance, and he's the co-author with Alex Marlowe of the Breitbart Business Digest. It's a daily, folks, and you ought to get your paws on it because it's the best product out there. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to turn to the great Sarah Carter talk about deportation and closing the border and the dramatic moves that Donald Trump has made in just his first week in office. Be right back.
This is the Larry Kudlow Show.